In the deepest layers of ancient tradition, where history and mythology cease to be separate categories, there exists a radically different interpretation of angels. They are not gentle beings with wings of light, nor are they healers driven by compassion. Instead, they appear as juridical agents, operating as strict adjudicators within what can only be described as a cosmic court, a legal system that transcends human comprehension. Before unfolding this worldview further, take a moment to subscribe and follow the channel, as each segment reveals a deeper layer of philosophical, theological, and symbolic interpretation, where the boundary between belief and cosmic law is continuously redefined. In this framework, the central question is no longer how do angels protect humanity, but rather something far more severe. What kind of law are these beings enforcing? When ancient texts are re-examined through this lens, a structural shift emerges. Angels do not act from emotion or mercy. Instead, they function according to the validity of a transcendent legal order that supersedes moral sentiment. They resemble officials of a universal judiciary, where every action, oath, and ritual is recorded as admissible evidence. From this perspective, the concept of a heavenly covenant becomes the foundational structure of reality itself. It is not a contract in the human sense, but a metaphysical system in which terms are inscribed not through language, but through existence itself. Within this covenantal architecture, blood is not symbolic. It is literal juridical ink. It is the irreversible medium through which agreements are written into reality. When blood is shed in ritual context, it does not merely signify life. It etches binding instructions into the fabric of existence, impossible to erase or revise. Alongside this, the universe ceases to be a passive backdrop. It becomes an all-seeing witness, omniscient, silent, and absolute. Nothing is overlooked. No oath disappears into oblivion. Every covenant, once established, is archived within an immutable structure of reality, beyond time, beyond forgetting, and beyond renegotiation. Within such a system, supernatural entities, including angels, guardians, and other cosmic agents, are themselves bound by an absolute legal framework. Crucially, this law does not operate according to human moral categories. It does not evaluate right and wrong through emotional weight, nor does it adjust based on suffering or compassion. Instead, it functions purely on covenantal validity. What has been established must be executed. What is broken must be corrected through restoration of equilibrium. In this worldview, mercy is not a governing force. It does not override procedure, nor can it intervene in the execution of cosmic law. A sworn covenant cannot be dissolved by regret. A blood-sealed agreement cannot be annulled by changing circumstances or emotional transformation. Everything is subordinated to one principle alone: structural validity. Thus, angels are not saviors in this system. They are executors. They do not arrive to comfort, but to verify. They do not forgive, but ensure compliance with the architecture of covenantal order. They stand at the intersection of law and reality itself, correcting deviation and restoring alignment to the original equilibrium of the cosmos. And within this cold precision lies a paradox. The more absolute the system becomes, the more stable reality appears. When every element is bound by unbreakable law, chaos is eliminated. Yet at the same time, this absolute order becomes fundamentally alien to human concepts of mercy and emotional justice. This is the foundation of a universe where blood functions as signature, oath becomes physical structure, and angels operate as tireless judges, preserving the coherence of reality's legal record, regardless of the cost required to maintain it. Continuing from this framework, the architecture of the blood covenant does not exist as an abstract theological idea. It operates more like an engineered legal system embedded into reality itself. What ancient traditions refer to as the covenants of Abraham and Moses are not merely historical or symbolic narratives. Within this interpretive model, they function as prototype legal structures, foundational templates upon which all subsequent covenantal reality is built. To understand this system, one must first dismantle the assumption that these covenants are metaphorical. Instead, they behave as procedural blueprints. The covenant with Abraham, for instance, is structured like a primal contract between the divine authority and a human representative. It contains what can be described as formal clauses, explicit conditions governing inheritance, land, lineage, and obedience. These are not poetic promises. They function as binding parameters that define the operational limits of reality within the covenantal jurisdiction. Within this structure, the blood seal operates as the authentication mechanism. In modern terms, it resembles an irreversible cryptographic signature embedded in biological matter. Blood, in this sense, is not symbolic of life alone. It is the verification medium that finalizes the contract. Once activated through ritual procedures, it confirms that the agreement has moved beyond intention into enforceable reality. There is no distinction between metaphor and execution here. The ritual act is the execution. The covenant with Moses extends this architecture into a more complex juridical system. It introduces procedural law, codified behavior, and collective responsibility. Yet at its core, it remains structurally consistent. Divine human contract, validated through ritual, enforced through an unseen supervisory mechanism. The key distinction is scale. What was once individual becomes national. What was once promise becomes institutional law. Ritual, within this system, is never decorative. It does not serve to remind or symbolize. Instead, it functions as an activation protocol. When a ritual is performed correctly, it triggers what can only be described as a metaphysical enforcement layer. In other words, ritual is the interface between the human world and the legal machinery of the cosmos. Without it, the covenant remains dormant. With it, the covenant becomes operational. From this perspective, the role of the watchers, or guardians, becomes structurally necessary. These entities are not passive observers, but enforcement agents of covenant integrity. Their primary function is threefold: to monitor the stability of the agreement, to protect the boundaries where the covenant is legally active, and to validate whether any interaction within those boundaries remains compliant with established terms. These boundaries are not abstract. They manifest across three distinct domains. First, geographic boundaries define sacred territory, lands marked as legally distinct within the covenantal system. These are not merely holy places, they are jurisdictional zones under divine governance. Second, ritual boundaries regulate actions such as sacrifice, consecration, and symbolic marking. Any deviation within ritual procedure is treated not as error, but as legal violation. Third, temporal boundaries govern cycles of observance, fixed intervals where covenantal obligations must be reaffirmed or reactivated. Time itself becomes part of the legal structure. In this layered system, guardians act as both enforcers and validators. They ensure that sacred geography remains uncontaminated by unauthorized acts, that rituals are executed with procedural precision, and that temporal cycles are maintained without deviation. Their presence implies that the covenant is not self-sustaining. It requires continuous supervision by non-human intelligences embedded within the legal architecture of reality. Extending this logic further, ancient covenantal documents can be understood as forming a kind of metaphysical bridge between heaven and earth. They are not inert texts. They function as operational nodes within a larger interdimensional legal network. Each covenantal record is simultaneously historical artifact and active protocol, binding two domains that would otherwise remain separate. This bridge, however, is not stable by default. It requires continuous validation. Without supervision, the structure risks collapse, not because the covenant loses meaning, but because its enforcement layer depends on ongoing confirmation. This is where the concept of cosmic certification emerges. The covenant must be continually acknowledged by higher-order intelligences that ensure its persistence across time. Thus, the system cannot operate autonomously. It is not a self-contained legal machine. Instead, it resembles a distributed architecture requiring constant oversight by supernatural agents who function as auditors of reality. Their role is not to reinterpret the covenant, but to confirm its integrity without deviation. In this way, the architecture of the blood covenant reveals itself as a vast, interlocking system, clauses encoded in narrative form, blood functioning as irreversible authentication, ritual acting as activation protocol, guardians serving as enforcement nodes, and sacred geography and time-forming jurisdictional boundaries. Above all, the entire structure depends on a continuous chain of verification that connects the human world to a transcendent legal order. And within this framework, reality itself is no longer neutral. It becomes a legally structured domain, held together not by belief, but by enforcement. Extending the system described in the previous sections, the enforcement phase of the blood covenant reveals its most uncompromising dimension: execution. Within this framework, a violation of oath, whether committed by a king, a nation, or an individual, is not interpreted through moral categories such as guilt, regret, or ethical failure. Instead, it is classified as a juridical rupture within the structure of reality itself. A breach is not wrong in a human sense. It is illegitimate in a legal metaphysical sense. When a covenant is broken, nothing emotional is triggered. There is no divine sadness, no anger in the human psychological sense. What occurs instead is a systemic response, the activation of covenant enforcement protocols embedded within the architecture of existence. The moment a sworn agreement is invalidated, the system recognizes a structural inconsistency between declared order and actual behavior. This inconsistency is not tolerated as ambiguity. It is treated as a critical failure requiring immediate correction. At this point, the mechanism of enforcement is activated. Ancient texts often describe this moment as the wrath of the divine, but within this interpretive model, such language is misleading if taken literally. Wrath is not an emotional state. It is a procedural consequence. It represents the system's automatic correction function, similar to a legal system executing judgment after a verified breach of contract. What is described as divine anger is, in essence, the restoration of juridical balance through forceful reconfiguration of reality. To understand this more precisely, one must reframe the concept of divine wrath as a form of asset reclamation. Within the covenantal structure, all granted authority, land, prosperity, sovereignty, protection, is conditionally allocated. These allocations are not permanent possessions. They are contingent privileges bound to compliance. When the covenant is violated, these privileges are revoked. What follows is not punishment for its own sake, but the systematic withdrawal of previously granted jurisdictional rights. In this sense, the divine operates less like a moral judge and more like a supreme enforcement authority within a cosmic legal system. Its role resembles that of a centralized executor of judgment, ensuring that the terms of the original contract are upheld without exception. The system does not negotiate with breach conditions. It does not reinterpret clauses based on circumstance. It simply restores the original order by removing illegitimate states of existence. This brings us to the operational mechanisms of enforcement, what ancient language might metaphorically describe as weapons or instruments of divine action. However, these should not be understood as physical armaments. Instead, they function as structural enforcement mechanisms embedded within reality's framework. One category of such mechanisms operates through systemic destabilization. When a covenant is violated, the surrounding order begins to lose coherence. Political stability collapses, environmental systems shift, social structures fracture. These are not random disasters. They are cascading corrections triggered by legal imbalance. The system does not need to attack directly. It simply withdraws structural support, and collapse follows as a logical consequence. Another category involves targeted intervention. In certain narratives, Specific individuals or entities are removed, displaced, or neutralized. Within this model, such events are not acts of personal punishment, but precision adjustments to restore covenantal equilibrium. The system identifies points of contradiction, where violation is concentrated, and resolves them through localized correction. The goal is not destruction, but recalibration. Importantly, these mechanisms operate without emotional variability. There is no escalation driven by anger, no hesitation driven by compassion. The system functions with procedural neutrality. Every response is proportional not to moral outrage, but to the degree of structural deviation from covenantal order. This is why divine enforcement must be understood as fundamentally different from human justice systems. Human justice is interpretive. It weighs context, intent, and circumstance. Covenant enforcement is structural. It evaluates only alignment versus deviation. In human systems, law is applied to behavior. In this system, law is reality itself. Therefore, the restoration of order is not optional. It is inevitable once violation is detected. The system does not ask whether punishment is deserved. It determines whether correction is required. If imbalance exists, enforcement follows automatically, as an intrinsic property of the covenantal architecture. Seen from this perspective, what is traditionally described as divine intervention becomes a form of systemic self-repair. Reality, structured by covenantal law, actively corrects deviations to preserve its own integrity. The so-called wrath is not external aggression, it is internal regulation. And yet, the most unsettling implication of this model is its precision. Nothing is arbitrary. Nothing is symbolic in the loose sense. Every enforcement action corresponds to a defined structural requirement. The system does not forget, does not delay, and does not negotiate with instability. In the end, covenant enforcement reveals a universe that behaves less like a living narrative and more like a self-correcting juridical structure, where breach is instantly recognized, balance is mechanically restored, and every consequence is the inevitable outcome of a law that never stops operating. Continuing from the enforcement logic established in the previous sections, the covenantal system does not remain confined to antiquity. It does not dissolve with the passage of historical time, nor does it fade into symbolic abstraction. Instead, it leaves behind what can be described as juridical residues, persistent structural echoes of ancient agreements that continue to influence modern reality in subtle but consequential ways. In this model, contemporary geopolitical tension is not interpreted solely through economics, ideology, or territorial strategy. Beneath these visible layers, there exists a deeper substrate: unresolved covenantal structure. Ancient oaths, territorial dedications, and ritualized claims to land are not considered neutral historical artifacts. They function as latent legal markers embedded within the metaphysical architecture of the world. As a result, certain regions appear persistently unstable, not merely due to political conflict, but due to overlapping claims within an unresolved covenantal framework. These metaphysical legal residues manifest across three primary domains. First, in political conflict, where competing narratives of legitimacy often echo far older claims of divine authorization. Second, in territorial disputes, where land is not only a resource, but a symbolically charged jurisdiction tied to historical covenants. Third, in religious discourse, where competing interpretations of sacred history function as competing legal readings of the same underlying covenantal record. In each case, modern disagreement mirrors an older structural tension that was never fully resolved within the system's original parameters. Within this interpretive structure, the concept of angelic observation takes on a new dimension. Angels are not active participants in daily human affairs in the emotional or devotional sense. Rather, they are understood as system-level observers, entities whose function is to maintain informational integrity within the covenantal archive. They do not intervene arbitrarily, nor do they act according to subjective judgment. Instead, they monitor the alignment between historical covenantal claims and present-day reality. In regions considered sacred or covenantally significant, their observational presence is theoretically continuous. These zones are not defined merely by religious designation, but by their embedded status within the original covenantal architecture. Angels, in this framework, function as custodians of historical continuity. Their role is to register deviations, track structural inconsistencies, and ensure that the legal memory of the covenant remains intact across time. This does not imply visible intervention. Rather, it suggests a constant, silent auditing process, an ongoing verification that the structural claims of the past have not been erased, distorted, or improperly overridden by later developments. In this sense, angels operate less like actors and more like living record systems embedded within the fabric of reality. Against this backdrop, the resurgence of ancient rituals in the modern world acquires a different interpretive weight. The revival of traditional ceremonies, symbolic reenactments, and covenant-like declarations is often understood culturally as heritage preservation or spiritual renewal. However, within the logic of this system, such revivals can also be interpreted as reactivation events, moments in which dormant covenantal structures are symbolically or ritually re-engaged. When a ritual associated with an ancient covenant is reconstructed or performed, it does not merely function as cultural expression. It potentially re-establishes procedural contact with the underlying legal architecture from which the original covenant emerged. In other words, ritual becomes a form of system re-access, a re-entry into a protocol that was never fully deactivated, only temporarily suspended. This raises a significant implication within the model. Reactivation is not neutral. The system does not distinguish between historical reenactment and operational invocation purely on symbolic grounds. If the structural conditions of the ritual align with the original covenantal parameters, then the system may interpret the act as a valid re-engagement of protocol. In such cases, dormant enforcement structures may become observably relevant again. Consequently, the resurgence of ritual practice is not merely a cultural phenomenon. It becomes a potential signal within the covenantal monitoring system. This does not imply immediate or visible reaction, but it does suggest renewed attention within the supervisory layer of the structure. In this sense, ritual activity functions like a reactivated signal in a long silent network. From this perspective, modernity is not detached from ancient covenantal law. Instead, it exists within its extended temporal shadow. Historical agreements continue to exert structural influence, not as conscious belief systems, but as embedded legal configurations that have never been fully removed from the architecture of reality. Thus, geopolitical tensions, religious revivals, and territorial disputes are not isolated phenomena. They can be interpreted as surface expressions of deeper, unresolved covenantal logic. And beneath these expressions, the system continues its silent function, observing, recording, and maintaining the integrity of a legal order that spans beyond human time. In this way, the ancient covenant does not end. It persists, not as memory, but as structure. Continuing from the structural logic established across the covenantal framework, the final layers of this system reveal not only how order is enforced and observed, but also how it is endured. If earlier sections described the architecture, enforcement, and historical persistence of the blood covenant, then what follows is the existential cost of living inside a reality governed by such an absolute structure. Within this model, participation in a high-order covenant is never neutral. It is not an abstract theological affiliation, nor a symbolic alignment with belief. It is a binding insertion into a legal metaphysical system that does not recognize partial commitment. Once entered, the covenant does not simply influence life, it restructures it. For the individual, this means the emergence of an irreversible binding condition. The act of covenantal participation generates obligations that extend beyond personal intention, beyond memory, and even beyond mortality, as it is commonly understood. The individual ceases to be an isolated moral agent and becomes a node within a distributed legal structure. Their actions are no longer evaluated solely as personal choices, but as elements within a broader contractual continuity that predates and outlives them. This creates a form of responsibility that is structurally inescapable. It does not diminish with time, nor does it dissolve through ignorance or neglect. Instead, it accumulates across existence, forming a continuous line of accountability that extends beyond the limits of a single lifetime. In this sense, the individual is never acting alone. They are always acting within the shadow of a prior agreement that continues to define the boundaries of what is permissible. At the collective level, the implications intensify. Entire communities, nations, and cultural groups may find themselves bound within overlapping covenantal frameworks that extend across generations. This produces what can be described as historical pressure, a condition in which present-day decisions are influenced by unresolved commitments established long before current actors entered the system. Responsibility, therefore, is not only inherited, it is structurally transmitted. This transmission creates a unique challenge: adaptation within an invisible system. Human societies are forced to operate within a framework of rules that are not directly observable, not formally negotiable, and not subject to revision through conventional means. Unlike legal systems that can be rewritten or reinterpreted through institutional processes, the covenantal structure described here does not offer such flexibility. It operates beneath visible governance, shaping outcomes without announcing its mechanisms. The central difficulty, therefore, is not ignorance of the system, but misinterpretation of it. When humans attempt to understand this structure purely through emotional reasoning, moral intuition, or political analysis, they inevitably reduce it to something it is not. The system does not respond to perception, it responds to alignment. It does not adjust itself to belief. It registers structural correspondence. Living within such a framework requires a different mode of awareness. It is not enough to interpret events as isolated occurrences. Instead, one must recognize patterns of constraint, continuity, and structural consequence. Every action exists within a network of prior conditions, and every outcome reflects not only present behavior, but accumulated covenantal alignment. From this perspective, survival within the system is not about avoidance of law, but about legibility within law. One does not escape the covenantal structure, one navigates it. The objective is not to evade enforcement, but to minimize contradiction within the system's internal logic. This requires recognizing where boundaries exist: geographical, ritual, temporal, or symbolic, and acting in accordance with their structural requirements. In practical terms, this means operating within defined limits rather than attempting to transcend them. The system does not reward resistance to structure. It stabilizes behavior that remains coherent with established parameters. The more consistent an actor is with the underlying architecture, the less friction they generate within the system's enforcement layer. At this point, the model reaches its final paradox. The covenant is simultaneously restrictive and stabilizing. It constrains behavior through absolute conditions, yet it also prevents total collapse by enforcing coherence across time. Without it, the system would dissolve into interpretive chaos. With it, reality becomes rigidly structured, but predictably ordered. This paradox defines the conclusion. What appears as constraint is also what produces continuity. The covenant is not merely a mechanism of limitation, it is the framework that prevents reality from fragmenting into incoherence. This leads to the concept of what can be described as terrifying safety. Within this structure, safety does not arise from flexibility or negotiation, but from absolute enforceability. Everything is stable because nothing is left undefined. Everything is secure because nothing is exempt. Yet this stability carries an inherent psychological weight. There is no space for emotional exception. There is no allowance for moral negotiation once structural validity has been determined. Mercy, in the human sense, does not function as an overriding principle. The system does not adjust itself to sentiment. It maintains itself through consistency. Thus, the final vision of this framework is neither comforting nor chaotic, but something more structurally severe. A complete metaphysical legal system in which reality is governed by covenantal law. Blood functions as the ultimate signature of binding agreement, and every layer of existence is shaped by the enforcement of contracts that cannot be erased, only fulfilled or corrected. Within this system, existence itself becomes a matter of legal coherence, and reality, as a whole, is nothing less than the ongoing execution of an unbroken covenant.